So the government of Trinidad and Tobago, this current administration, continues to insult the intelligence of Trinidadians, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and not only the people of Trinidad and Tobago, but the wider Caribbean. This government putting out a narrative out there as if the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Persad, despite every single other leaders in CARICOM voting for the Caribbean and Latin America to remain a zone of peace, that the Prime Minister deciding that she's not going to vote, that somehow all the other leaders in the Caribbean don't know what they're talking about. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, she's going to be on the right side of history. And the latest with this now is Sean Sobers. Sean Sobers at a recent press conference try again to defend this whole idea of Trinidad staying out of this vote because the Caribbean and Latin America is not a zone of peace, in particular Trinidad and Tobago, because of the increase in crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And Sean Sobers is someone that I actually have respect for as a politician. I see Sean as a young, bright, future star in politics, someone that could potentially be a future prime minister. You know, I look at him the same way I look at Emery Brown from the PNM. You know, not the same way like how you'd see like Roger Alexander, which I don't know how that guy end up in politics, because I just don't know. I don't know how he end up in politics. But as I said, Sean Sobers is someone that you can see that he's intelligent, the way he articulates himself, and would make a good future prime minister. But the thing with politics sometimes is that when you are in a political party and you get this script to read, you just have to go ahead with what the head of the party is saying. And I believe that is the position that Sean Sobers finds himself in. I actually don't think that Sean Sobers believes most of what is coming out of his mouth. I think that is just something that is coming down from the head of the party, and he just have to abide with whatever the administration is doing, and you have to go ahead with it. So I actually feel bad for him. But this is the latest with the press conference with Sean Sobers defending the idea that Trinidad and Tobago don't consider themselves to be a zone of peace based on domestic crime and violence that is happening in Trinidad and Tobago.
In terms of an impasse with respect to the zone of peace, I mean, I think our Prime Minister, myself, Parliamentary Secretary Morris, we've made it abundantly clear. The concept of the zone of peace, and we've discussed this in so many different forums, by now I thought it might have been pellucid. The concept of the zone of peace is a concept that was created or connected to a CELAC resolution. And it is not to say then that Trinidad and Tobago does not wish for Trinidad and Tobago to exist in a zone of peace. The position is that we have not been existing in a zone of peace. Other countries may be fortunate to say that about themselves. We can't. And if we are to be sober about it, no pun intended, having been through a crime scourge for the last decades plus, with recording over 600 murders in a year, Trinidad and Tobago has been disproportionately affected by transnational crime for some time. When you juxtapose those statistics to other countries within the Caribbean region, who record sometimes 4 murders for the month and 40-something murders for the year, and they're experiencing a crime wave, you can understand why we are in a totally different category. And to essentially hide behind a veil of a saying that there is a zone of peace when we know one does not exist for us, it is incumbent upon a government, which we are led by a Prime Minister who has that vision and that belief that we need to make Trinidad and Tobago a zone of peace.
So that was Sean Sobers there trying to articulate to the media why this administration don't consider Trinidad and Tobago to be in a zone of peace because of the increase of crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And as I said, I believe that Sean Sobers is very intelligent. He articulates himself very well. But I think him sitting down there and trying to bring these facts to this conversation is pretty much insulting to the intelligence of the people in Trinidad and Tobago and the people in the wider Caribbean. Sean Sobers brought up St. Vincent. One of the reporters brought up St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the conversation. And Sean Sobers tried to use St. Vincent and some of the other Caribbean islands as an example that, look, these other leaders in the Caribbean that are voting for the Caribbean and Latin America to remain a zone of peace, they're not faced with the same crime problem as Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is severely impacted because of its proximity to Venezuela and the drugs and guns flowing from Venezuela. And it is so convenient that no one in this administration have pretty much admitted that, look, the guns in Trinidad and Tobago are not coming from Venezuela. They are coming from America. It's so convenient that no one from this administration is willing to point that out, and that illegal firearms cause a bigger problem in Trinidad and Tobago than drugs. Trinidad and Tobago is not necessarily a final stop for drugs coming from Colombia or Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago is pretty much a transshipment route, just like Jamaica is a transshipment route, just like we see in recent times St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other parts of the Caribbean have become a transshipment route for drug trafficking, going from the Caribbean and Latin America to North America. And when St. Vincent and the Grenadines was brought up in the conversation, and for the minister to try and use St. Vincent as an example to say that, look, when an island like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they only face 4 homicides per month compared to what Trinidad and Tobago, they don't understand the impact of this crime and violence and the impact that it's having on Trinidad and Tobago. While skipping over the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is 15 times the population of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So while St. Vincent and the Grenadines might experience 4 in terms of homicide per month in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that would put St. Vincent and the Grenadines in a more dire situation than we see in Trinidad and Tobago because of the size of the population. And it's just so convenient how that's all left out of the equation. And when we're talking about the Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace, also this administration conveniently leave out the idea that the Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace has nothing to do with domestic violence. Before this agreement was signed, first in 1983 and then 2014, crime was always in the Caribbean. It might not have been as much as now, but crime was always a part of the Caribbean. This agreement was signed to prevent what happened in Panama, also what happened in Grenada with the Maurice Bishop administration, and what happened in Cuba. So this was signed not for domestic crime and violence, but to keep international forces from out of the Caribbean and Latin America. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago knows that too well, because in 2014, when this agreement was revisited in Cuba, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, she was the Prime Minister at the time. She was the person that represented Trinidad and Tobago in Cuba at the time, and the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago had no problem with the Caribbean and Latin America being a zone of peace when she was Prime Minister in 2014. And in 2014, when the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, she was in Cuba when this was being revisited. As I said, 2014, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and Guyana as part of the West Indies was already 3 of the countries that had some of the highest homicide rate in the entire world. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. The numbers are there to prove it. You can go and look them up yourself. Crime and violence in the West Indies is not something new. While it might be new to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, while it might be new to Barbados and some of the other islands like Grenada and St. Lucia. But Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana have been fighting this problem for decades. And as I said, when the Prime Minister was there in 2014, she was there in Cuba, signing on to this deal, recognizing the Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace. And the images are there to prove it. The signatures are there to prove it. So I don't know what changed, why now the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and this administration is trying to conflate this whole idea that peace in the Caribbean is linked to domestic violence. The Caribbean and Latin America zone of peace has nothing, let me repeat, nothing to do with domestic violence. Domestic violence always exists within the Caribbean, within Latin America. This is about keeping international forces from out of the Caribbean. Okay, and just in case there are few people that they're still not understanding this Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace and what it really means, let me just drop some history lesson. So this was actually taken, the Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace was adopted from a resolution that was in Africa. So Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in 1963 at the United Nations General Assembly, Haile Selassie addressed the world when he spoke about war within Africa. And this is coming from way back with the scramble for Africa, when in 1880, the European countries decided that they are going to divide Africa and they are going to go in and colonize Africa by brute force, by war. In that United Nations General Assembly in 1963, the words from Haile Selassie, that was an inspiration to the song that Bob Marley later coined, War. And these are the words of the song that came out of the United Nations General Assembly, the song from Bob Marley, War. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited. Until there is no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, Mr. War. So those were the words from Haile Selassie at the 1963 United Nations General Assembly, put in music by Bob Marley, War. And when we talk about peace and the Caribbean and Latin America being a zone of peace, the absence of peace is war. The absence of peace is not domestic crime and violence. And as I said, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago knows that because she was there in 2014 when this agreement was being signed. So yes, we understand that the Caribbean right now, especially when you look at St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, and some of these smaller islands that never had a problem with crime and violence, and in recent times we're seeing crime and violence increase to an uncontrollable level in the Caribbean. We understand that governments have to come together to get a hold of this crime and violence. And for the past 10 years, this have been a priority for CARICOM, for all of the chair of CARICOM within the past 10 years, whether it's Mia Motley, whether Dickon Mitchell, whether it's President Ali of Guyana, all the CARICOM chair had this on their priority list, along with food security, that look, we need to get a hold of illegal firearms coming from America into the Caribbean in the gun for drug trade. So this has been a priority. They have been talking to successive governments of America to say, let's partner and deal with what is going on in the Caribbean Sea. Not to be out there in the Caribbean Sea bombing boats, and not to be trying to overthrow a government in Venezuela. Because everyone seems to know, everyone except this administration, that even if the Americans are successful with overthrowing the Maduro government, as long as there's an appetite in North America for drugs, the drug flow is always going to happen coming from Colombia, and whether it takes the route of Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, St. Vincent, it is going to get to America as long as the appetite is still there. So if the Trump administration really wants to have a war on drugs, that war on drugs have to start where the consumers are, and that is in America. So guys, sound off in the comment section and let me know your thoughts on this one. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content. And remember, peace. I'm out.